Good morning, everyone, and happy Election Day here in the US. My name is Greer Gosnell. I'm a Senior Research Associate at the Payne Institute. Thank you for joining us for this morning's webinar, in which we are very grateful to hear from Leena Srivastava, who is the Deputy Director General for Science at the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis, which is an independent and international research institute with global reach that focuses on issue areas that are too complex to be solved by any single country or academic discipline on its own. She's also been a lead author for the IPCC, a vice chancellor and executive director at the Energy Research Institute, which we all know as TERI, in New Delhi, and among a number of other impressive roles she's held, for instance, advising the UN, Future Earth, and the Asian Development Bank on climate change and sustainable development. As many of us will have read about over the last several months, a number of climate researchers and analysts are drawing parallels between the requisite response to COVID in terms of mobilizing actions at every scale and the need for action at all scales to address climate change. And Leena's team has spearheaded an initiative called Bouncing Forward Sustainably to identify opportunities for environmentally sustainable structural change in the wake of COVID. Which we have the pleasure to hear about this morning. So just a quick housekeeping note that we will be recording this meeting to make it available for those who might be at the polls or otherwise unable to attend this morning. And without further ado, Leena, thank you so much for joining us today, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Greer, and thank you to the Payne Institute for having me here. It's a pleasure to share with you some select outcomes from the initiative that we undertook at IIASA, along with the International Science Council, on bouncing forward sustainably pathways to a post-COVID world. Can I have the next slide, please? I would like to start with a disclaimer, which is that the messages that I have decided to present over here to this audience are the ones that I have selected according to the topic that I had proposed, and it may reflect my own biases and may not be the highest priority items, but I think they speak to the subject. So moving on from there, a little bit of a background to this particular initiative. I think what we had done was in the month of May, we recognized that there was a huge transformative potential that was arising from this response that was taking place to COVID-19 and the accompanying lockdown, which forced a number of stakeholders to come up with new innovations. And they provided new evidence on how we could possibly design sustainability pathways going forward from this experience. I think we understood the importance of strengthening the core defining frameworks of economic systems to enhance resilience to systemic shocks. This again was pretty obvious in the first few months. Recognize the need to support and accelerate such transformative green shoots in order for them to sustain. So I think the recognition was very clear that even though we believe that certain changes, certain adaptations that were taking place to COVID-19 were positive, but without some intervention from governments, from civil society organizations, from international organizations, we ran the risk of slipping back to what one now calls the old normal. We also recognize the urgency of such support to inform the recovery packages, because as we are all aware, there are several countries in the world that have already announced their recovery packages, and these run to above $12 trillion, which have been committed. So if we do want to take these recovery packages and align them better with a more sustainable future, which is aligned to the climate goals and the sustainable development goals, we need to be informing them very quickly as a science community. And that really meant that we could not afford to wait for the full evidence to be gathered, for the data to come in place, for all the new business models to come into place. And we really started working on this initiative as the changes were taking place. And as we know now, almost 9 months after the initiation of the COVID response, that we are nowhere close to the end as far as this particular pandemic is concerned. Vaccines are still not in place, and the recovery process itself is going to take a few years to finish. So to arrive at the new normal in a stable manner. So we compensated for this inability to wait for the full evidence by garnering renowned trans and interdisciplinary expertise from across the world to help us frame these recommendations and to endorse the recommendations that were coming out from this initiative in terms of the transformative changes. In order to keep the whole exercise a little manageable, we identified 4 themes on which we would focus. 2 were on the core frameworks of governance and science systems, which run through the entire economy. 1 major contributor for mitigating the climate problem, which is an enabler of sustainable development as well, and that is the energy sector. And 1 theme which was representing the major vulnerabilities for any country, and that is food. Next, please. In terms of process, just very quickly, again, to help you understand how we went about it, we organized 3 online consultations in this very short time period that we are talking about, from May till September. And these 3 focused on 3 broad sets of stakeholders that we wanted to consult. The first one was the science, academic, or research communities, basically to try and get an understanding from them that the initial shortlist that we did of transformative changes were indeed the ones that we should be pursuing, and that science would endorse these as the transformative changes that need to take place. And then we went to the practice community and spoke to them and asked them that if these are the changes that science is saying can and should be put in place based on the evidence arising from COVID-19, what is it that they would need to actually be able to translate this potential into a reality? So we spoke to the private sector, to the financial sector, to civil society organizations, and the range of other stakeholders in this community. And finally, in the last round of consultations, we spoke to policy and decision makers or influencers to see whether the demands that we would put in place so that they are able to create that enabling environment for the transformative change would actually be realizable. So following this particular process, we actually identified a fairly large number of transformative changes that can be put in place. And all of these cannot be presented in one webinar. So therefore, the selection that has taken place from this long list. Can I have the next one, please? So here I'm going to present to you just some of the key messages that we have from this process. And the very first message that I would like to bring to your attention is the fact that we as humanity have unleashed extreme, multiple, and compounding risks for ourselves. And not only have we done this, we have recognized that we are doing this for the last several years or decades, but we are still completely unprepared for them. And I think COVID-19 was a very good example where we knew that there could be another coronavirus strain that is going to hit us. And this was predicted by scientists almost a decade ago once again. But it again caught us totally unprepared. And now when we talk about pandemics of this kind, combined with the impacts of climate change, combined with some of the economic shocks that we are seeing and social turbulences across the world, we are talking about these multiple and compounding risks, which would require a very different scale of response. So what we need to do is possibly develop risk scenarios for these cumulative compound multi-hazards and assess the impacts of these potentially clashing hazards on humanity and the systems that we have in place, the governance systems, the science systems, etc. I think we also recognized the fact that we need to urgently focus on adaptation and resilience building, not just within the country, but internationally. And we also have to be able to build resilience in dealing with nonlinear system outcomes. The third thing that really, stared us in the face when we were going through the online consultations was that while historically we had been focusing on greater independence and security was the buzzword, we spoke about food security, we spoke about energy security, we spoke about water security and so on. But increasingly, I think in the post-COVID kind of months that we have seen, the refrain has moved to equity, justice, and resilience that have to be the new mantra for development. So strategic impact assessments that we do typically have to be redesigned and a greater accountability brought in for equity, justice, and resilience in our patterns of development. We also recognize the fact that systemic crises of the kind that we are talking about will need systemic solutions. And in order to be able to deal with these problems and solutions in a systemic manner, we do need mechanisms. And we have here said high-powered ad hoc coordination mechanisms that would engage multiple stakeholders would be needed for this purpose. So this particular slide, which is really an introductory slide, also starts to talk about the kinds of partnerships. And the reason why I decided to focus on partnerships for the future is because if you look at the two defining agreements, international agreements that we have, the Paris Agreement and the Agenda 2030 that puts forward the Sustainable Development Goals. There are several others, of course. Both of these recognize the role of partnerships, but possibly in somewhat different ways. In the SDG, in the Agenda 2030 document, we do recognize partnerships for sustainable development, but a lot of it is about knowledge sharing, experience sharing, and so on. In the instance of the Paris Agreement, partnerships are really spoken in the context of collaborating for mitigation efforts and collaborating on finance and technology and things like that. Whereas what you will see coming out in the slides as we move forward is a very different kind of a partnership, which informs the processes and the underlying systems that, that determine how we function as an economy and as societies. Can I have the next slide, please? So we spoke about the four themes. The first one then we decided to name as responsive government. Can I have the next one, please? And one of the key recommendations, the umbrella recommendation that we have here is that we need smart evidence-based adaptive governance in order to be able to deal with the risks that we are facing and to provide the resilience that we would need. And there are several points under this that we have to address ourselves to. One, of course, is the alignment of recovery packages to the future we want, drawing from the Agenda 2030 document, and that we need to intervene to be able to realize the multiple dividends that are possible from these huge investment packages that we have available to us. I don't think the world can anymore afford to look at making investments for benefiting just one sector without recognizing the systemic impacts on other sectors and the synergies and trade-offs that are involved over there. In the governance discussions, there was also a fairly loud call for a renewed focus on decentralization and localization, of course, supported by a more conscious and green globalization as well. So while historically we walked into globalization without really understanding completely the implications of globalization, I think today when we are looking at restarting our economies, we do have that choice on what is it, which are the activities, which are the businesses that need to be based on a globalized world, whereas which are the opportunities that we have where we can actually build local capacities in a much stronger manner, thereby providing more jobs, which is one of the key drivers that we have for the recovery packages. We also have a huge opportunity to harness the new consciousness in society, which is visible all around, definitely in the developed world, but also in the developing world, in terms of the impact that our consumption choices are having on not just the environment, but also on issues of equity and resilience. So the importance of inclusive participatory governance came up very strongly. And there was a demand to create webs of security at all levels, global, national, and local. So today, I think we do have a number of multilateral organizations that are dealing with specific problems that we are facing, be it around development, for example, handled by UNDP, or health handled by the World Health Organization, or issues of education and science handled by UNESCO, and so on. But when we talk about coherence at a national level and the need to have more evidence-based policy making, etc., I think the same applies also at a global level, and the same applies at a local level as well. So how do we mesh these different institutions that exist at different scales to be able to give us that web of security that we need in times of crises in particular? And of course, there is a call to reform, reconfigure, and repurpose institutions of global governance, which came up very strongly. So once again, the need here in the governance theme was very strongly on policy coherence at all levels, on partnerships with society, on inter-organizational partnerships, and so on. So it's really about providing the frame on the basis of which we would redesign societies. Can I have the next, please? Under strengthening science systems, there were again a set of recommendations. Next slide, please. And I think the strong message from here was that the science systems are in urgent need of strengthening and reform. So there was a wide-scale recognition of the importance of agile, relevant, systemic science for evidence-based decision-making at all scales. Agile because, as COVID-19 again revealed to us, that we were caught unprepared and we needed to be able to respond very quickly, which meant that we needed to have the databases in the form that would be most useful. We needed to have the tools and the methods for undertaking the analyses that was required. We needed to be able to mobilize different disciplines to work together and collaborate as required to provide us the solutions that we needed, etc. So that agility is something which is critically important, and systems have to be designed for that purpose. They have to be relevant. And then, of course, coordinated so that we are actually reflecting the complexity of the world and interconnectedness of the world that we are living in. And for this, I think that we need to strengthen the international network of scientists to enable faster knowledge and skills transfer. So in this interconnected world that we have, it does not suffice to have the expertise concentrated in certain parts of the world and not available across the world. I think there's also a recognition that all of this science and knowledge that we have has to be placed in context. It has to be situated in the local context that exists. And thus the solutions that we come up with also have to be relevant to the context that we are talking about. The second point that we have over here is that the science policy society interface must be strengthened, which implies, again, capability building in both scientists to be able to design and communicate the research at a level that is understandable by the common person, and the wider society as well to absorb and use the science effectively. So while we talk about evidence-based decision making at all levels, I think this issue of science communications and the science policy interface, I think it came up very strongly. It was also pointed out that we need new incentive frameworks for sustainability science. And this would need a redesign along the entire value chain of science production. Today, we know that we find it difficult to publish system science or sustainability science articles in the top class journals, which are normally discipline based, although the situation is fast changing. We need to recognize that the evaluation criteria for proposals also tend to be somewhat biased against sustainability science because, again, there is not enough experience in those systems and so on. So along the entire value chain of science, there needs to be this recognition that the world out there requires systemic science to be in place to respond to the interconnected complexities of today. Open access to data and science has to be mandated. And I think there is a strong recognition that private data is enormous and it is not necessarily available to science for the public good. So this private data too has to be made available for science is the recommendation that we have. And the context issue I've already mentioned. So there are all kinds of new partnerships that we have been talking about, but we have possibly not been able to operationalize in the manner in which they need to be and with the agility with which they need to be mobilized. So academia, government partnerships, academia, society, I forgot academia, business, coherence across this entire research value chain and partnerships within science, I think are also extremely important. And again, COVID-19 provides a very good example. We know that the scientists that were dealing with health issues were aware of the fact that we could have another COVID, another coronavirus hitting us very soon. But it did not possibly go much beyond the health scientists to the range of other scientists that would have helped us prepare better for this particular pandemic. I think there's also the problem of translation in a sense, because while one set of scientists may have understood the importance of this particular potential hazard that was facing us, this could not get communicated to everybody else. Can I have the next couple of slides, please? Yeah. So this is, this one is focusing on the 5 major transformative changes. We spoke about strengthening transdisciplinary research and networking on critical risks and systems resilience at global, regional, and national levels. So one is the cooperation across the disciplines of science, but also cooperation across multiple stakeholders. I think, again, we really do not know how to go about doing this and how to evaluate the research that actually is based on transdisciplinary approaches. We need a much greater focus on enhancing the diffusion of scientific knowledge within the science system and building trust. I should definitely focus on that a few times during this presentation. Improve the quality and efficacy of science policy interface, enhance communication, and increase the capacity of the science system to respond. So I think that these are all the key recommendations for the science systems to be strengthened. Can I have the next one, please? We move on from there to addressing the drivers of energy demand. Energy, as we know, is one of the sustainable development goals that actually cuts across almost all of the other 16 sustainable development goals that we have. Can I have the next slide, please? And is a major contributor to the problem of climate change that we are facing. So in the context of the energy discussions that took place in this initiative, a few things came out very strongly. I think COVID-19 reinforced the fact that energy is merely an enabler. Energy is not demanded as a product in itself. It is a means to arrive at a service that humanity is seeking. So energy is in the role of an enabler, and I think if we recognize it as such, then there are many new transformative options that open up. In that context, demand reductions came up to be a very strong transformative change that would become possible. If we recall, Sustainable Development Goal number 7 has 3 sub-goals. One is on to do with increasing the share of renewable energy. The second has to do with improving energy efficiencies. And the third centers around the issue of energy access. Demand reductions per se do not find a place in SDG 7. But here, I think we have focused very clearly on demand reductions, and this came from the fact that we, as a response to the COVID-19, had to change our way of going about life. So we moved, there was a lockdown that almost all countries imposed. We moved into remote functioning. We moved into more of a service-driven economy, etc., all of which had significant implications for the energy sector, so much so that we estimate that in the time period between 2019 and 2020, we would have reduced our energy consumption sufficiently to result in an almost 8% decline in the emissions of greenhouse gases. Now, when you compare this with the target that we have for 2030, it does not seem to be a very large reduction in emissions. But when you compare this with the fact that we were struggling to reach peak emissions by the year 2020, that means we were looking to bend the curve of emissions in the year 2020, and now we are looking at an 8% reduction with no preparation that went into it and no real thought to sustaining these kinds of changes. I think this is not a mean revelation. I won't say achievement. It's a revolution that we have, that we can actually bring about significant reductions in our energy consumption and therefore greenhouse gas emissions if we were to give attention to some of the developments outside of the energy sector. So in our case, I think a few things that really stood out was the issue of urban form, of building design and purpose, and how we use these spaces, the workspaces and the work itself that is being undertaken, particularly in urban areas that account for nearly 70% of energy consumption and the emissions, the mobility choices that we adopt, and of course, the role of digitalization in the entire functioning of an economy. So if we look for energy solutions beyond renewable energy and beyond energy efficiency into the design of everything else that demands energy for providing a particular service, we are likely to be able to achieve the goals that we have on the climate side, possibly much more effectively. The second major recommendation that we have as at a broad level is that it's not so much energy security that we should be striving for as it is energy resilience, because that is what is going to hold populations in good stead, especially when we find ourselves in situations of multi-hazards. So this would provide us with the way forward. It would give us local empowerment, decentralized renewable energy-based solutions, and of course, allow for a number of social innovations that could give rise to jobs and income generation opportunities and entrepreneurship at this local level that we are talking about. Finally, I think a shared service economy, if we are able to move towards that, could definitely drive sustainable consumption. We would not be in a position where we need to own equipment and appliances, but if we have shared services, we would be driving energy efficiency as well as renewable energy much more effectively. So all of the goals of the Sustainable Development Goal 7 plus demand reductions can all be effected if we just decide to do things somewhat differently. There is a different set of stakeholders that would need to come together in these partnerships and to determine the design of future urban communities and the work that we undertake. So here again, I think the role of partnerships becomes critically important. Can I have the next slide, please? And the final theme that we looked at was on resilient food systems. And the next one, please. And here, I think we recognize the fact that the food sector basically multiplies the systemic vulnerabilities that we have. And the food-related vulnerabilities are also multiplied by other systemic vulnerabilities. For example, the loss of income, which was a big thing as far as COVID-19 was concerned. So this humanitarian and socioeconomic crisis that was triggered by the pandemic revealed the fragile nature of the food system, which is extremely sensitive to seasonal timelines. So as opposed to the other themes that we dealt with, I think in the case of food, days in the agricultural cycle can make a significant impact on the vulnerability of the system as a whole. And I think this in particular requires a great degree of agility as far as the response is concerned and an understanding of the sensitivity of time. There's also a very vast unorganized labor force which functions in this theme, and this is organized around the seasonality. So it's not about 1 year or 2 years is a very long time frame in the agricultural cycle. So for every season where you have a disruption, it could have a significant implication on the livelihoods of millions of people. Inability of governance systems to adapt quickly to shifting demands of those most in need. So the other thing that we recognized in this particular sector is that it was not the supply that was as much of a problem as it was the demand. And the patterns of demand changed. There was, in certain countries, definitely in the world, a lot of movement of people that took place that also meant that the food systems needed to respond to this mobility of populations. And that, again, we found ourselves wanting in. And of course, supply chains broke because of the lockdowns that we were suffering from. So all of these actually compounded the vulnerability of the food systems and particularly those at the bottom of this chain, the farming community, quite significantly. We also need to recognize the fact that there are a number of countries that are dependent on exports for sustaining their economies, and these countries were particularly badly hit and would be in need of support. But at the same time, international cooperation and the development assistance that is being provided has come under question as a result of COVID-19. And so on. So there were a large number of recommendations in these areas. Can I have the next slide, please? And some of the things that we need to do in this sector is definitely focus more than in other cases on resilience, equity, and justice. I mean, these issues really stood out. Shift to a systems emphasis on resilience and equity rather than only productivity and efficiency. So thus far, I think the whole agricultural sector was driven by the need to enhance productivity. But I think moving forward, we once again need to shift that emphasis to resilience and a greater equity. One of the things that COVID-19 did for the world is that it held a mirror up on what a poor job that we have done of removing the inequalities across countries and within countries. And that really forces us once again to take a close look at how we are designing our systems and how we are ensuring that these recovery packages or any other policy interventions that we might put in place will actually result in the desired outcome for the poorest of the poor in countries and across countries. There's also a loud call for integrating human and planetary health perspectives through the management of ecosystems. to be able to foster innovation, technology transfer, and scale up of agricultural sustainability practices. This is also at the same time recognizing that agricultural systems in different parts of the world are at very different levels of modernity and sophistication. But while that is the case, there is also a huge opportunity for international cooperation that we have to be able to build upon. Strengthen the mechanisms for international collaboration and partnership. So here again, we talk about partnerships between the food and health communities, between local governments and scientists, local governments meaning at the very local level, as also farmers and other stakeholder communities. Can I have the next slide, please? So those were the 4 themes that we looked at in this particular initiative. And can I have the next slide, please? Juliana? Right. In sum, what I would like to say is that through these 5-6 months of multi-stakeholder consultations that we organized, while we were not able to do too much quantitative analysis, which we proposed to do in phase 2 of the work that we are doing, but from a narratives perspective and from a consolidation of expertise perspective, we came to the conclusion that there are several transformations or transformative actions which are within reach that could lead to transformations, some in the near future and some in the slightly longer term future. But these transformative actions need to be taken today so that we prevent the lock-ins as far as possible. However, these transformations require global collaboration and fact-based decision making. And we at the same time find that the systems for global collaborations and cooperation are actually failing us. And this is another area in which we do need to focus quite intensively. Pursuing these required transformations will require new types of partnerships between government, civil society, the public, and the private sector. And while we spoke about the ineffectiveness or lack of understanding of how to design these partnerships in some difficult sectors, like, for example, between governments and civil society or scientists and civil society. We have had several examples of public-private partnerships, but I think it is also a fact that several of these public-private partnerships have also not functioned to the desired outcomes that we instituted them for. So what goes wrong in these partnerships is a very significant question, and how do we design it is also a significant issue that we need to take a look at. Having said that, I think the bottom line is that we do have an opportunity as well as a need to redesign our life, our economic systems, our work life. How do we go about it? The choices that we make and how we organize our social life as well. All of these issues of redesign are the ones in which partnerships are also equally important, but partnerships in the major international agreements, as I mentioned early on, have not addressed themselves to this kind of redesigning our life. So finally, I think just a few additional thoughts from my side. I mean, when we talk about partnerships over here, I think we need to understand this word partnerships. And I was proposing the following again for some feedback from you, that we should be in a position to recognize the linkages and the interconnectedness between these different stakeholders. And we should be able to collaborate for sustainability outcomes across these partner groups that we have been trying to identify. We need to have defined shared goals and be accountable towards achieving those goals. We need to ensure effective communication, not just in terms of the language, but also the flow of information that takes place between these partner organizations or institutions or entities. And most importantly, there has to be trust. And this, I think, is the most precious attribute that seems to be missing in almost every relationship that we can think about today. So on that provocative note, I will stop my intervention at this point. Thank you very much. Greer?
Thank you, Leena. Yeah, thank you so much. That was a wonderful presentation, and hopefully a hint of optimism at the end if we can work on that trust element. I couldn't agree more with everything that you've said here. I mentioned JPAL to you early on. I think they're one of the great organizations who are doing this evidence-based policymaking and creating partnerships between governments and academic researchers and business and academic researchers. And hopefully we can build on that model and expand that model. So we're going to go to some Q&A. We have a question from Martin Volker, who says, I think going back to one of your earlier slides, how do you propose to create incentive frameworks for sustainability science? And what steps are you envisioning to do that?
So there are a large number of steps that have been identified during the consultations that we ran, but I'll just share with you a few things that come to the top of my mind. One of the biggest incentives, of course, is about publishing these research in the top quality, most sought after kinds of journals. And typically you find in the context of sustainability science that the number of such journals is actually fairly limited. And from our understanding in talking to the publishers from these journals as well, that the capacities to be able to do a proper review and evaluation of these journals is also a problem. When it comes to research funding, once again, the metrics that are used to look at the success of the projects, again, do not appreciate a systemic approach or systemic outcomes to the same level as you might have for purely discipline-based or single stakeholder-based outcomes. Within institutions, whether these are educational institutions, academic institutions, or research institutions, once again, it appears that there is little incentive to undertake systemic research that is also transdisciplinary in nature and focused on problem solving as against creating new knowledge. So I think when we talk about incentive frameworks, we do need to look at this entire value chain, as I mentioned in the presentation, and look at the interlinkages across these to be able to provide that right kind of incentive, which is not to say that systemic research or sustainability science research is the only kind of research that needs to be done, but it is a much more important form of research that needs to be undertaken in today's context and the emerging context, and that needs to find its place in the knowledge sector that we are dealing with.
Great. I guess a follow-up question I have for that is which institutions are responsible for facilitating this type of cross-collaboration? Is it research funders? Is it, for example, I'm an economist, is it the American Economic Association? Who are the groups who need to be taking actions on these fronts? And how can we as scientists encourage them to do that?
So it's a whole range of actors that would be involved. I mean, definitely governments for sure at different levels. Research funders have a very critically important role to play but even over there, I mean, the setting of research agendas also, I mean, so it's not a linear kind of a responsibility. It's an iterative circular responsibility. And there has to be these feedback mechanisms from the science community to the policy making or policy influencing communities and back as once again. So it has to be the governance systems for science. It has to be the research funders. that there are, it has to be the pool. It has to do with the PhD research that is taking place in the university systems as well. Because if you do not produce those sustainability science researchers, then you are not creating the pool of capability that is required. Plus, I think equally importantly, the geographical mix. So a lot of the research that is undertaken in developing countries is actually research that is funded from the developed countries or is undertaken in collaboration, as you were mentioning here just now, that you're working with JPAL here in India to come up with some very interesting research. So those collaborations, and now if those collaborative mechanisms break because of greater inward focus of countries and reduced funding that is available for international cooperation, etc., this entire system breaks down. So I think there are many places where we need to strengthen the way we are undertaking this sustainability science research, and all of them would be responsible.
Excellent. Thank you for that, Leena. We have another question here from David. Says, thanks, Leena, for the great presentation. You highlighted that we need new mechanisms for partnerships and transformations, require new types of partnerships. At the international level, my questions are, who should lead this? What should the mechanisms look like? And how can we identify the types of partnerships needed? Thank you.
Thank you. And that's also a great question. Very, very difficult to answer. Let me try and see if I can give you an example from the energy sector, one of the sectors that we looked at and one of the sectors that I'm also most comfortable with. I think there was a very strong recognition, a little late, but still, that energy as a subject is being dealt with across multiple multilateral organizations, whether it was the World Bank or the IFC or UNDP or even the World Health Organization, UNDESA. There's a whole range of organizations, UNIDO, UNICEF. I think that there's a whole range of organizations that we're dealing with energy within the UN system itself. And I'm taking that as an example. So the UN decided to put in place an umbrella organization called Unenergy, and they had somebody who was heading at the level of an Undersecretary General, who was heading this UN Energy initiative. And the whole idea was that there should be much greater collaboration across all of these institutions, but it was still focused on the subject of energy. So I think I can dare say that while we have made good progress in this kind of a coordination and partnership across different UN institutions on energy, we still do find that there are huge areas of overlap, repetition, and uncoordinated interventions, especially in the countries in which their programs are targeted. And I emphasize the fact that we are talking about only the energy sector, because in an ideal situation, when I spoke about the web of security, we recognize the fact that energy is very closely interlinked to food, it's very closely interlinked to water, and we have a large quantum of work that is taking place on the food, energy, water, land nexus kinds of issues. But the different, if I stay with the UN as an example, the different UN organizations that are dealing with these different subjects do not necessarily align their goals, their programs, their funding priorities, their projects in countries to be able to get those multiple dividends that we are demanding from national governments. So this needs to take place. Who is going to be responsible? I think in this instance, it was the UN Secretary General and his office that took that particular initiative. It was part of the One UN initiative as well. Is it effective? There is a lot of ground to be covered. Should we still try it? Yes, it should. Where should the pressure come from? The pressure can definitely come from the member countries. Do the member countries have understanding of these? possibly not to the same extent as those who are advocating for it have. So does that mean that we need to have a better communication? Yes, we definitely need better communication between the science communities who are working on these, the civil society organizations that are demanding this as well as governance systems. So once again, I think there is a highly interconnected set of systems that come into play. Pressure points are many. They need to align, and that is where the role of partnerships comes in. So you have the pressure point from the science communities, you have the pressure point from civil society organizations, and today you have certain pressure points that are coming across from young people across the world. How do these pressure points come together? Do we know how to leverage each other for the global public good that we are all trying to achieve? So it's easier said than done. I do recognize it, but it's definitely a goal that I think we need to pursue.
Another phenomenal answer. So we have another question from Camilla. What are some specific policies that you think will help in supporting a more equitable food system? And I might add to that, just because you mentioned evidence-based policymaking several times in the presentation, how many of these are backed by evidence? And maybe you can give an example of what you mean by evidence-based policymaking in this context.
So thank you for the question. And then for the add-on, Greer, there was a very interesting paper that recently, there's a preprint that is available that speaks to the fact that that a number of policies that we have implemented across the world, be it in the developed world or the developing world, actually, even though they are social policies, do not necessarily address themselves to the issues of equity and justice. There is also very little literature that has evaluated the impact of these policies on issues of equity and justice. I do not have a ready link to that paper, but I'll be happy to send it to you, Greer, and you can forward that if anybody is interested. But the fact is that we do not design policies and do not follow through to ensure that these policies are actually coming to the outcome that we need. So we assume that we are sensitive to the needs of the poorest of the poor, or the most deprived, or the most marginalized. And we assume that we are designing the policies to benefit them. But more often than not, the beneficiaries stop a little above this group that we are trying to address ourselves to. So the evidence base that you talk about, Greer, is actually pretty poor and inadequate, and there's not enough research that is taking place in that area. Specific policies that will help us in supporting a more equitable food system, again, it depends on where are we seeking that equity as well. I mean, so if we are looking at nutrition, it would be a different set of policies that we are looking at. If you're looking at just food, it would possibly be somewhat different. If we are looking at income earning opportunities for the communities that are involved in the food system, then I think the policy sets that we are looking at would be different. But I think the most important point over here is that, as I mentioned somewhere during the course of my presentation, that when we do these strategic impact assessments, we need to have a very clear method and a follow-up to ensure that the benefits of these policies, no matter how well-intentioned they are actually resulting in the outcome that we want from those policies. So I'm sorry, I'm not giving you a very specific response on policies, but happy to take further questions or even engage in an offline discussion on some specifics.
Sounds great. We have a comment again from David, who said it would be great if a Unenergy type organization could be developed for each of the other 5 transformations. Do you have any comments you want to make there?
Yeah, I mean, because even Unenergy, as I said, is a stop short of taking a systemic approach. And to me, I mean, even though I was very closely involved in the design of the SDG 7, I think I'm equally culpable in not really focusing on demand reductions as much as they should have been focused on. So we keep addressing ourselves to supply, we keep addressing ourselves to efficiencies and to greener forms of energy, but not the fact that we can live our lives differently and achieve the same levels of happiness and satisfaction, or similar levels of happiness and satisfaction, and livelihoods, or lives. I wouldn't say lifestyles, livelihoods. Without necessarily consuming the same amount. So it's not just reducing consumption in other sectors, but you can reduce consumption in energy as well. So I think when we talk about that web of security, we do need to create, I agree with you, David, that we need to create Unenergy type organizations in other places, but then all of these have to be networked. They have to arrive at common goals and then ensure that we are able to meet those goals, with each organization undertaking its set of activities aligned to those strategic goals that have been defined.
Absolutely. That was a great note to end on, because we're running close up to the hour now. You are preaching to the choir here on we can find ways to meet our needs and be equally happy while reducing our consumption. And I agree with you that that's an area that has not received enough attention. Perhaps I'm biased because I work in that space. So thank you, Leena. Thank you so much for sharing your insights this morning at 10 p.m. in India over there. Thank you also to those of you who joined us in the audience and for your engaging questions. As I mentioned earlier, we did record this webinar and it will be posted on our website shortly. We encourage everyone to check out the lineup of past and future Payne webinar speakers on the website. And with that, we hope everyone is staying safe and healthy, and that you all have made a plan to vote if you haven't voted early already in the US. Thanks again to you, Leena, and have a wonderful rest of your day, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Leena.